A damning report accuses Kazakhstan of abusing the rights of workers in the country's oil fields. We ask, where is the rule of law in the largest country in Central Asia? And is the problem confined to Kazakhstan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, a human rights group has accused the government of Kazakhstan and 3 oil companies of abusing and repressing workers in the country's oil fields. In a 153-page report released on Monday, Human Rights Watch examined last December's events in western Kazakhstan. At least 15 people were killed and more than 100 injured. It happened when police fired on striking oil workers. The report accused the government and the oil companies of restricting workers' rights to freedom of assembly, association and expression. From Almaty, here's Robin Forestier-Walker.
The bloodshed in western Kazakhstan last December ended the country's longest-running industrial dispute. Police in the oil town of Usen shot dead at least 12 people. Dozens of protesters, oil workers and bystanders were wounded. In May 2011, thousands of oil workers employed at 3 different companies, one with Chinese management, another run by Italians, went on strike over pay and conditions. Demonstrations were broken up, union members were intimidated and lawyers were jailed. More than 2,000 workers lost their jobs. Under Kazakh law, strikes in the petroleum sector are illegal. In its latest report, Human Rights Watch says that goes against international standards.
There are problems with the law, and the law extends across Kazakhstan's many sectors of the economy. So until that legislation is addressed, problems with that legislation is addressed, then yes, there is a risk that other companies, workers in other sectors of Kazakhstan's economy will find themselves in a situation where their rights are restricted.
President Nursultan Nazarbayev was quick to respond to the Zhenauzen violence. Decrepit industrial towns like Zhenauzen have been promised investment. Workers who had been fired were given back jobs, but 13 strikers received prison terms. 5 police were also jailed for abuse of power.
The Kazakh government has officially responded to the Human Rights Watch report with this statement in which it lays the blame for the industrial unrest mainly on mismanagement by the oil companies themselves and local officials. Political opponents have also been swept up, accused of stoking the violence. 3 are still on trial. But observers like Human Rights Watch say the real problem lies with repressive legislation, which up until now remains largely unchanged. Robin Forestier-Walker for Inside Story in Almaty.
Well, President Nursultan Nazarbayev has been in office since Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991. Since then, he has ruled the country as a one-party state that the West has been happy to do business with. Kazakhstan is a country of 16.5 million people between Russia and China. In the last 2 decades, the economy has attracted billions of dollars in foreign investment. In 2001, Kazakhstan strengthened its regional ties, joining China and Russia to launch the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. 6 months later, then U.S. President George W. Bush declared a commitment to a long-term strategic partnership with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is also one of the world's biggest oil producers with over 3% of global reserves. But the gap between rich and poor is wide there, and the population is made up of several ethnic groups, which has been the source of deep-rooted tensions. So where is Kazakhstan's workers' rights now? And to help us answer this question and a whole lot more, we're joined by our guests in New York, Jane Buchanan, a senior researcher on Europe and Central Asia Division for Human Rights Watch. In Brussels, we have Tim Noonan. He's the head of the campaign and communications at the International Trade Union Confederation. And joining us via broadband from the Kazakh capital Astana is Usen Suleiman. He's ambassador at large at Kazakhstan's Foreign Affairs Ministry. Welcome to all of you. Usen Suleiman in Astana, I want to start with you. This report by Human Rights Watch is over 150 pages long. It is it's quite a large indictment of workers, the situation of workers in Kazakhstan. What is your government doing to address those concerns?
Thank you, Hassan. Actually, we welcome and encourage involvement of domestic and international NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, in examining the tragic incident and the subsequent judicial process in Zhanaozen, and in helping to develop a fuller understanding of events and highlighting the critical issues that need to be addressed. Unfortunately, Human Rights Watch made a very biased report on Kazakhstan, and I'm very much hopeful that, and I would want to see their report on the events in South Africa with these platinum miners, which also suffered some injuries and they were victims. Yes, we do acknowledge that the company management and authorities in Zhanaozen systematically failed to address the concerns of the oil workers, and the dispute was allowed to fester, creating an environment which enabled a small group of individuals to turn what had been a long-running, relatively peaceful protest into a violent riot. And these individuals have been held accountable for their actions, as have the senior officials and management whose conduct contributed to the outbreak of violence and mishandling of events on the day. Actually, in the report, there is no one word about what the government has done and is doing in the region. I only just now heard this from Mr. Robin Forestier's information, which you now broadcasted, that only he mentioned that partially what the government is doing there. I want to emphasize that the special employment centers have been opened in Zhanaozen and Aktau to assist applicants in finding new jobs in the local area and further afield. A total of almost 2,000 formerly dismissed oil workers which were striking. It is 100%. They were re-employed at newly established enterprise under the two companies there. Actually, taking into account that oil industry is one of the most profitable sphere, the workers in the region get salaries.
Forgive me for interrupting for a moment, but I just want to pick up on something that you said earlier when you said that this report by Human Rights Watch was biased. On what basis are you saying that it was biased? Because from reading some of the report, it looks pretty extensive. That they spoke to people from all sides. They spoke to workers and who gave personal accounts of their abuses at the hands of the authorities. So on what basis, basically, are you saying that this report is one-sided?
Yes, I had a look through the report and found out that there were statements on that the authorities are violating the human rights. If we get to the core of the issue, it was not the authorities, completely the authorities who violated. It was the company management. And you know that the companies are belonging not only to Kazakhstan. The shareholders of them are major foreign companies.
All right. Sorry, if it's the company management, then what is the government in Kazakhstan doing to hold that management to account?
Yes, of course. You know that our president, when he visited the site there quickly after these riots taken place, he admitted that the oil workers were not at fault at all. It were the management who were, and local authorities were at fault. Is not that the acknowledgement by my head of state that the issue is there?
All right. Jane Buchanan, I know you want to respond to some of what Usen Suleiman has just said, but I also want to ask you as well about what you think are the most troubling aspects, in your opinion, about this report.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, we have documented the extensive measures that both companies and the government took to interfere with workers' rights last year in Kazakhstan, in Western Kazakhstan, that unfortunately, in one case, one strike was brought to this very bloody end in Zhanaozen, which has been mentioned extensively. As you mentioned, the report has documented very closely the events by interviewing workers. We attempted to approach the government for their response to the issues. We did not receive a response in writing from the government. We have subsequently met with the authorities to discuss our concerns and the facts documented in the report. And we really look to the government to seize this opportunity to make some important reforms and important changes. with respect to sort of who has responsibility here, absolutely both sides do, both the government and the companies. The government must hold the companies accountable for the way that they operate in the country and whether they respect laws, national laws and international law. So to put all the blame on the companies here really isn't accurate, and it's a way that the government appears to be avoiding responsibility. So in addition to holding the companies responsible for the actions that they took, which the government didn't do, in several cases we documented how workers tried to go to the authorities to ask the authorities to intervene, to assist them and help them in after they felt that their attempts to unionize or organize had been interfered with on the part of the companies, and the government really failed to respond effectively or in some cases at all. What we also saw the government do is break up peaceful strikes, arrest strike leaders, sentence them in unfair trials. So there's a range of steps that both the government and the companies took here.
All right, Tim Noonan, how does the situation in Kazakhstan and what you've read from this report compare with the labor conditions that you've seen in other countries?
Well, the events in Kazakhstan were very traumatic and really an appalling indictment, in our view, both of the government and of the companies. I'd just like to say a word on this question of bias. We know Human Rights Watch methodology very well. We think they're a respected organisation, and I'd point out that the very same charge was levelled at them when they reported recently on the plight of migrant workers in Qatar, and in fact their report checks out. We have the same facts and the same analysis. So I would reject the idea that Human Rights Watch are biased. More fundamentally, what we've seen in Kazakhstan is representative of what's going on in many parts of the world now. Fundamentally, workers now in so many places are at the mercy of employers because governments are not putting in place proper legislation. They're not abiding by the rules set by the international labour organisations, which governments themselves have set at the ILO. And what is very clear and should be an absolute lesson that any government should learn out of the events in North Africa and the Arab world in recent times is that repression and violence simply don't pay. Even in a country like Burma, where for decades now the rule has been the rule of force and not the rule of law, the authorities are beginning to turn the corner and open the country and are seriously talking to the ILO, talking to us about introducing a proper legal framework that respects the fundamental human rights of people at work. And unless and until governments like the government of Kazakhstan do that, then these problems are going to continue. Yes, the companies are culpable, but they're operating in an environment where governments are not fulfilling their responsibilities. And we know from survey work around the world that this is a mounting and very deep concern in populations all sorts of countries.
Let's put some of that then to Usen Suleiman in Astana. I mean, what potential is there for this to grow into something bigger if the government doesn't address this in a meaningful way? I'm sure you're aware of the events of the Arab Spring over the last couple of years, particularly in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, where it was worsening economic conditions and the lack of workers' rights that in a big way contributed to what eventually led to those uprisings in those countries. Isn't that something that your government has to be concerned about, that you don't want a repeat of that in Kazakhstan, do you?
Thank you, Hassan. Actually, let me stop on what the government continues to do in the region, proceeding from the fact not to repeat such cases anymore in the country, and I'm more than sure that there would be no such cases in the future in my country. Actually, after the riots, Kazakhstan has allotted $25 million for the immediate restoration of the town and critical infrastructure there. To improve the social situation in the town, the government approved the plan of construction of 26 facilities between 2012 and 2015, creating 900 permanent jobs for teachers and doctors and developing a platform for journalism's longer-term economic growth. Actually, I'm thankful to international NGOs who visited the site. Among them is the Ombudsman of German government, the head of the Freedom House, and many other NGOs who attended, including the Penal Reform International. They visited the site, and they gave us very precious and constructive suggestions and recommendations. And I'm very much hopeful that Mrs. Jane Buchanan and Tim Noonan will be constructive and will give their best and wholesome recommendations to us. One of the things I want to accentuate on is that it might be the result of the presence of the international community in the site with their help. I refer you to our president's article, which is called Social Modernization of Kazakhstan, 20 Steps Towards a Universal Labor Society, which was published on the 10th of July this month. And out of 20 instructions or directives, I would like to mention only two, which I think would answer your question. First is upgrading of social legislation, including law on mediation, law on trade unions, and the labor code. Now we're working on the amendments of these laws, and the Ministry of Labor has received from the Trade Union of Kazakhstan the draft of the new legislation on their activity. Also, our president has instructed to revise the national legislation in the social area by the end of 2012. And the most important thing is the prevention and regulation of labor disputes. He says, let me quote, "Neither the labor code nor the administration and criminal codes include articles on the responsibility for provoking labor disputes by employers, officials, and other persons." This is what my president said.
All right, I want to turn to Jane Buchanan for a moment and ask her about the point that's been made as well, that Western energy companies are heavily invested in this region, where substantial reserves in countries like Kazakhstan could help countries like the United States diversify its oil supplies from places like the Middle East. But there's obviously, in your view, a responsibility for them to highlight these unfair working conditions. On a practical level, what can they do, though?
Well, companies operating in Kazakhstan or in any country, I mean, have some basic responsibilities to respect human rights, including worker rights, and so that means steps that they can take internally to have a code of conduct that they exercise throughout their operations, that they expect their affiliates and their partners to exercise, that is developed, ideally in consultation with experts on labor law or human rights. And that they implement that code and they monitor it to make sure it's being implemented. At the same time, it is again coming back to the government. I mean, the government has a responsibility to ensure that these companies are respecting. But
isn't this part of the problem? I mean, you make a valid point there about the responsibility being on the government. Isn't it easy then for the foreign companies to say, well, this isn't our problem. You have to talk to the government about this?
No, it really isn't easy for companies to say that anymore. I think that we've seen over the last decades a consensus emerge globally that companies can't just go anywhere they want and operate any way that they want to when there's a vacuum of government responsibility and government oversight. Whether it's in their supply chains or in other types of actions that companies are undertaking, they have a clear responsibility to ensure that their operations aren't infringing on human rights, to take measures to remedy situations where there have been violations. And this obviously includes at the most basic level the people who are employed by them or employed by their subsidiaries should have basic protections like the ones we're talking about, to form a union, to meet meet with their union leader, to collectively bargain and expect that the company management is going to make a good faith effort to bargain with them. And if they feel that they've exhausted all possibilities, or in the case of Kazakhstan, the legislation doesn't really afford them real possibilities to collectively bargain, then that they can take their complaints to the street and go on a peaceful strike. That's a fundamental right, and the government has to respect it, and the companies have to respect it. And they should see that going on strike is a last-ditch effort, and it's a signal to the company that they really need to step up in their efforts to find a resolution with the workers.
Tim Noonan, just to play devil's advocates here for a moment and take perhaps a slightly cynical view here, there is one view that would say, at the end of the day, the demand for oil around the world is still pretty huge and isn't going to go away anytime soon. There's a market for drilling oil in a place like Kazakhstan because it has so much of it. And as long as that dynamic exists, what incentive is there for any sort of international pressure to be applied?
Well, I think there's every incentive, and this comes both to the questions of corporate governance, as we've just heard, and also to the question of government responsibilities. Unfortunately, the very weak legal framework that exists in so many countries in the world enables companies, if they are ill-intentioned, to get away with all kinds of violations and egregious behaviour. There are also responsible companies. We've heard this week, for example, the head of a Swedish clothing retailer calling on the government of Bangladesh to increase the minimum wage for clothing workers in that country. Unfortunately, the government has refused to do so for reasons that we simply don't understand. What we do know is that from the survey work I mentioned earlier, global polling that we've been carrying out in the course of this year, two-thirds of people, and I'm talking about a 13-country opinion poll from a range of countries at different levels of economic and political development, two-thirds of people believe that the real power over government is exercised by corporations and the finance sector, and only 23% of people feel that the voters have a real say. This is really a fundamental breakdown in the role of government that's happening in so many parts of the world. It's encouraging to hear the ambassador talk about reforms to the labour code. We're certainly willing to talk, and we're certain that the International Labour Organisation will also be willing to support a bringing of the legislative framework in Kazakhstan into conformity with the international standards and making sure that legislation is implemented. I have to say, though, that we've been told many times by governments, yes, we'll talk to you and work through our legislative drafts with you, without actually ever having governments follow through. We've been waiting, for example, nearly 4 months for the government of Qatar to fulfil the promise it gave to us in the month of June in that regard. So we're looking for not only words from government, we're looking for action, and we're looking not only for words and denials from companies, but precisely the kind of prescription that Human Rights Watch have set out in terms of the responsibility of companies, not only for their core operations and their headquarters, but for their entire supply chains.
Jane Buchanan, I just want to give you the last word on this in a minute or so that we have left. If the foreign organizations and companies ultimately don't respond to this, is it in the end going to take uprisings from within countries like Kazakhstan in the mode of the Arab Spring, a wider uprising for people to really notice this?
I think that is a really extreme case, and it's very much the intention with our reporting in Kazakhstan and in other places to bring about change that's effective, that respects human rights principles, and from the ambassador's statements and from a few other signals that we've gotten from the Kazakh government, there does seem to be a bit of willingness to begin to open the discussion on these issues, to make the reforms that will ensure that people's rights are protected and they don't have to go to extreme lengths to have their voices heard, that they can do so relying on the courts, relying on the government to fulfill its obligations, and thereby, really see the country emerge as a country that respects the rule of law and human rights, for its workers and for all of its citizens.
And that's going to have to be the last word. I want to thank all three of our guests in New York, Jane Buchanan; in Brussels, Tim Noonan; and in Astana via broadband, Usen Suleiman. And that's it for this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. There's the address on the bottom of your screen. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for all of us. The latest news is up next. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.